three most common problems in Czech lease agreements. Number one, your flat is not officially a flat. Number two, your landlord is not the owner of the apartment. And number three, your lease is actually not a lease agreement, but a sublease agreement. And why is this important, or why these three things are important? Because if you want to use your lease agreement for any official purposes, it must meet some criteria. And either of these three will make sure that you are not meeting the criteria. So that's very important, because if you sign a lease for a year or two, then you take it to the Ministry of the Interior and they tell you, okay, but this is not a proper lease, then you're fucked. That's how it is. So I'll also give you some tips on how to deal with these kind of situations and how to prevent any potential problems. But it's not only about the official purposes and the Ministry of the Interior and everything. It's also like about your own protection, because if you sign a lease, for example, not with the owner of the apartment, what can happen is that the real owner will come to the apartment and kick you out, and you have nothing to, like, you cannot do anything against it because you don't have a proper lease. So I'll go now through details, through all the three of them in details, and I'll explain the most important bits, okay? So just a second, I'll just drink and then I'm all yours again. Okay, so the problem number one, your flat is not officially a flat. That happens often because I'll tell you some examples why it happens or when it happens, but there are more, but it happens often. And it often happens even in new apartment buildings, like just newly built, like 2 years ago, 3 years ago. It happens in the biggest apartment project in the Czech Republic, which is the Garden Towers in Žižkov. And some of the apartments are actually not apartments. And how it happens is a couple reasons. First, for example, landlords reconstruct the cellar space or the attic space below the roof into apartments. So it can look as a completely normal apartment. It has kitchen, bedroom, everything looks normal. But because it doesn't meet some official requirements, like, for example, the cellar apartments don't meet the amount of light requirement, for example, or the attic apartments don't meet the temperature or insulation norms. So they are officially not listed and cannot be listed as a proper apartment. They are listed as something else, for example, called atelier, which basically is not a flat. It's not a space for living, and you cannot officially live there. Sometimes they can even be like business spaces, but either way, you cannot live in such a space. Even if it looks as a proper apartment, if it's officially not listed as an apartment in the land register, cadastre, then you cannot live there. And this doesn't only happen when landlords reconstruct the cellars or reconstruct the attic spaces. It also happens if, like in the new projects, there, for example, must be some percentage of business spaces in the building. So let's say the city agrees that you can build the house, but 20% of that must be like business space. And developers, of course, don't want to have 20% of the business space, so they make some apartments officially a business space. So they meet the requirements, they get the donation or whatever, but actually those are apartments, but officially not apartments. And I've seen it in Garden Towers, okay? That's like one of the newest projects, the biggest apartment complex in the Czech Republic, very new building, like 3 years old, and some of the apartments are not apartments. Sometimes it also happens if you split a big apartment into two smaller ones. Because, for example, that's also what I've seen in Garden Towers, that there used to be one big apartment, then they made a smaller one out of that, and the wall in between those two apartments was very thin. So you could hear everything on the other side, in the other apartment. So that officially doesn't meet the insulation or the noise-proof regulations. So it's not an apartment. Neither of these is an apartment. So that can obviously be a big problem for you. So that was number one. Number two is that your landlord is not the real owner of the apartment. That can happen in many cases. It's often now it's connected to Airbnb because usually Airbnbs were not done by the owners, but by some management companies, or like just someone rented the apartment and then that was subleasing it to Airbnb hosts, visitors or whatever. And that still remains until now, even though the flats are no longer used for Airbnb, for example, but it's still not managed by the owner, but by some management company or real management company or whatever. That's not the only reason how that can happen, but if the flat is, if you're not signing the lease agreement directly with the owner, but some representative of the owner, you need to have some extra documentation to be able to use the lease agreement for official purposes. For in the number one, like if your flat is not officially a flat, then just don't sign any lease like that. Don't rent the apartment, go away of that. Don't even think about it, because it will only create problems for you. So number one, flat is not a flat, don't sign the lease at all. Number two, if your landlord is not the owner of the apartment, you can still sign the lease, that's fine, but you need to have some additional documentation. So for example, if you're signing a lease with Mr. Peter, but Mr. Peter is not the owner of the apartment, then you need to get the connection between the owner of the apartment and Mr. Peter, who is signing the lease with you. Okay? So there usually is a power of attorney, for example, that this owner of the apartment gives a power of attorney to Mr. Peter to deal with the apartment and like lease it or sublease it to other people. Or there is some, but that will be number three. I will be talking about that more in a couple seconds or minutes. That the person, Mr. Peters, would have to have his own lease agreement between him and the owner. So you would need to provide all these documents to the Ministry of the Interior. So not only, or like any official purposes. So not only your lease agreement, but also a notarized copy or original of the power of attorney between the person renting it to you and the owner, or a notarized copy or the original of their own lease agreement between the owner and the person who's renting it to you. There is one company called Ideální nájemce, I believe, and that's a mess. That's a mess. They can usually get it sorted out, so that's I'm not like shaming them or anything, but there is always like 7 different powers of attorney, because it's like there is the owner, then there is this company called Ideální nájemce, which is leasing the apartments from the owner. So there is a lease agreement between these two. And then someone from the company is signing the lease with you, or sublease actually, but it's not the director of the company. It's someone with a power of attorney who was given a power of attorney by someone else, who was given a power of attorney by someone else. So it's like 3 different powers of attorney, and then sublease agreement, and then like your lease agreement or sublease agreement. So you always need to have like all these documents. They need to all meet some criteria. So for example, the power of attorney should have notarized signatures. You always need to have notarized copies of everything. So it's doable, but it's way more complicated, and you need to be very careful and check everything very, very carefully. Okay? And number 3, your lease is not actually a lease, but a sublease. That happens in many cases. Some of them I mentioned in number 2, like when you're not signing the lease directly with the owner. So often you don't sign a lease, but a sublease, and then the tenant has the lease agreement. But there is one very common thing in the Czech Republic, and that's something called a Druzstvo. That's like a housing cooperative, coop. And that's kind of, that can be very much problematic for you if you want to sign a lease agreement like that. Because how it works is, like generally, the idea is that people don't really have money to like buy a whole house or buy the apartments. So like a housing cooperative buys the apartment, or it used to be the way that they even built the apartment building. And then each of the owners of the apartments were basically paying kind of rent towards the housing cooperative, and they were paying the rent for that long that eventually they could buy the apartment, or they actually paid for the apartment, and the apartment, they could take the apartment into private ownership and take it out of the housing cooperative. So they're kind of owners of the apartments because they kind of established the housing cooperative and everything. So they often act like owners. They tell you, yeah, I'm the owner of the apartment and everything. And they kind of mean it because it's probably kind of true, but officially the flat is owned by the housing cooperative, not by the individual persons. Even though they create the housing cooperative and like everything, but officially the owner is the housing cooperative, the Druzstvo. And if you want to live in the apartment like that, you need to get some additional documentation, and that can usually be one of these two things. Either, which is usually the easiest. So number one would be that you need to get connection between the person who is signing your sublease agreement and the owner. So in this case, the owner is the housing cooperative, and you're signing a sublease agreement with the tenant. So in basically 99% of cases, there is a lease agreement between the housing cooperative and the landlord. So the easiest thing to do is just to get this, like a notarized copy of this lease agreement between the housing cooperative and your landlord, and then you have your sublease agreement. And if you combine them, that's fine. Or sometimes you need to get some extra consent of the housing cooperative, saying that they agree with you living in the apartment of this person. Because as I explained, the housing cooperative is kind of like all the people created the housing cooperative. So they also created their own rules, how you can behave in the apartments and like what you can do and what you cannot do. So in some cases, the housing cooperative as an entity does not really agree with sublease in the apartment, because it was originally meant for the people to live there and not to have like business out of that. So sometimes it's written, for example, in the lease agreement between the housing cooperative, between Druzstvo and your landlord, that they cannot sublease it without a consent of the housing cooperative. So in that cases, you would need to get the consent of the housing cooperative. And that can either be easy or very complicated, because often it works the way that if the housing cooperative wants to let someone sublet the apartment, they need to meet for that. And like everyone needs to agree on that or something like that. And they only meet like once in 3 months. Or you just need to catch the director and the vice director of the housing cooperative. And they often like don't really have time and they don't want to sign anything. So it can, again, it doesn't have to be a problem. It is solvable. The number one, if your flat is not a flat, that's not solvable. So don't sign a lease like that. If you want to sign a sublease agreement in a house owned by a housing cooperative, it's doable, but you need to be sure that you get all the documents connecting the landlord to the housing cooperative, or that you get the consent of the housing cooperative with you living in one of the apartments. So that's, I guess, it about the most common problems. But now, let me tell you how to deal with these problems. Okay, so I would say there are just two kind of pieces of advice I can give you if you're looking for an apartment. I did another video about the situation on the market and how bad it is, and it really is bad. So I imagine that people now are like desperate and they are willing to sign whatever kind of contract just to have an apartment secured. On one hand, it's understandable. It's better to have a roof above your head than not to. On the other hand, it's still better to have roof above your head and have all the documents, all the paperwork correct, than to have roof on your above your head, but then have to move out of the apartment in 2 weeks or 3 months or whatever, because you cannot officially use the lease agreement for any other official purposes. So tip number one, how to deal with that. Don't sign any reservation contract before you see the actual lease agreement, because now chances are you will be leasing or renting an apartment through an agency. Like as a foreigner, finding an apartment directly through a private landlord is not really high. It's most likely not going to happen. You can get lucky and it can happen, but most likely you will be renting an apartment through an agency. And the agency, of course, will want you to sign the reservation contract as soon as possible, because they have like tens of other people interested in the apartment. So they will kind of try to push you to sign it as soon as possible. Don't sign anything before you've seen the lease agreement, because if you haven't seen the lease agreement and you sign the reservation contract, then you're obliged to pay their commission, which can be mostly it is 1 month rent. So if you're looking for a flat for 30,000 crowns, the commission will be 30,000 crowns, sometimes plus 21% VAT, and you're obliged to pay it as soon as you sign the reservation contract. Okay, so if you sign the reservation contract before you see the lease agreement, it can work out, or it can be like really shitty lease agreement and you end up like in a big shit. Yeah. So that's thing number one. Don't sign anything before you've seen the lease agreement. Second thing is connected to that. Have someone check the lease agreement. Unless you've seen like hundreds of lease agreements, or you're like experienced with the Czech law, or you studied the Czech law and you know the housing market and everything, then don't sign any lease agreement before someone checks it. Or at least the basics, even if it's okay. I don't really want to say this, but it's better if at least like a Czech speaker checks the lease agreement. Definitely, Czech speaker is not like a like how to say, like if you ask a colleague who speaks Czech to check your lease agreement, it doesn't mean that he will check it properly. Okay, if he has no education in this field, or he hasn't signed like a million like lease agreements, then they still might miss something and they might still like give you bad piece of advice. But it's better if at least someone checks that in Czech, so they know, okay, hey, this sounds strange, or this is kind of weird. So at least they can give you some feedback. That's the minimum you should do. Have a Czech speaker check it. Even if you have like Czech and English contracts, still have someone check it, because chances are they've seen at least a few lease agreements in their life, so they might be able to tell, okay, this is bad, or this is okay, or something. But ideally, have some professional check it. If you have us to check your lease agreement, we can do it for free. If we just check the two main things: who is the owner and if the flat is the flat. It takes us like 5-10 minutes to check, and we'll be happy to do that to make sure that you sign a proper lease. Or of course you can hire our full service to deal with everything. But even if you don't hire us and you hire a lawyer to check that, even if you pay, or even if you want us to check the whole lease agreement and you will pay for like 1 hour consultation, then it's still worth the money to make sure that everything is fine in the lease. Or if there are some complications that you know about them in advance, then if you sign a lease agreement, pay the deposit, pay the commission, pay the first rent, and then you take it to the Ministry of the Interior and then tell you, hey, you cannot use this, you're missing 2 documents. Okay, and then you need to move out of the apartment. You've lost your deposit. You've lost your reservation contract, or the fee for the commission for the real estate agent, and you have nowhere to live, and you're in the beginning of the search anyway. So definitely, I recommend you to have the lease checked by a professional because for example, we've been in the business for 10 years, and I've seen couple hundreds, maybe even thousands of lease agreements. So I can say, hey, I know what to check exactly. And really, these 2 things are the most important. Like, who is the owner and if the flat is the flat. That's usually what I check first before I start checking the rest of the lease agreement. Because if those things do not check out, do not match, then it makes no sense to read the rest of the contract, because it doesn't matter. If you're not signing the lease with the owner, makes no sense to read the rest, because it's not valid anyway. So those are the 2 things we always check. And then I would say that most contracts, most lease agreements are kind of very similar. There are no like there can be small tweaks or small changes. Someone wants you to do like make the insurance, someone doesn't. There might be small changes, but it's generally like a standard contract. But I've seen recently some really, really bad contracts. I've seen a contract where you paid for everything. If you like farted too loud in your apartment, you would pay like 1,000 crowns fee for doing that, because you were like interrupting the neighbors, and like really the contract was full of such points, and penalty for this, penalty for that, penalty for this. So we didn't recommend the client to sign the lease, or if they signed it, then it was their own risk, and we at least like translated everything, explained how it works, and that this is not a standard contract. So definitely that's one advice I would give you. And second advice, if there are problems with the apartment or with the lease agreement, meaning you're not signing it directly with the owner, but with some representative of the owner, or if you're signing a lease where the flat is owned by the housing cooperative, don't sign the lease before you get all the relevant documents connecting you to the owner. Okay, so if it's the housing cooperative, as I explained, you have to get one of these two documents, either a sublease agreement of your landlord between him and the housing cooperative, or a consent of the housing cooperative that you can live in the apartment. And definitely don't sign the lease agreement before you see these documents, because if the landlord can tell you, yeah, I've done this for every tenant I had, I will give it to you, sign the lease, and I'll bring it to you next week. Okay, yeah, you might trust the landlord, but you might get fucked up as well, because then yeah, I will bring it to you next week. Next week, I will bring it to you next week. Yeah, the director is now on holiday, he cannot sign it. Yeah, now the vice director is on holiday, he cannot sign it. Yeah, sorry. And then you can end up like really being in big trouble, especially if you need the lease agreement for your visa application or extension. You need to give it to the ministry or use it somewhere officially. That can be a big problem. So definitely make sure that you get all the relevant documents before you sign the lease, because if you don't do that, you might never get the documents and you might end up in a very bad situation. So maybe just one last thing I'll do for you while you are online, or while I'm online, is I will show you where we check. The first thing we do when we get a lease agreement is that we go online to the land register, to the cadastre, and we find the address of the apartment and the exact apartment number and everything. Hi, Daria, thank you for joining. And we check those two things as I mentioned. So first, who is the owner? And if it matches with who is written in the lease agreement. And second, if the apartment is really an apartment. So we get online and we get this kind of confirmation from the cadastre, from the land register. Okay, and here shows, this point says if it's an apartment or not. This says bit, which means that the flat is a flat. Bit means a flat in the Czech, in the Czech language, in Czech. So if you see that the flat is a flat, that's good. But sometimes you can see here that it's atelier, or it's nebytový prostor, or it's jiný nebytový prostor. Anything else than bit or dům, so flat or a house, is usually bad. So this is the first thing we check. Second thing here is the ownership. So you see who is the owner. So for example, in this case, you see that this is the apartment number. It's really an apartment. It's bit, it's flat, and these are the owners. So if you check this and you have the name of this person in your lease agreement, that you know that everything is fine and that you can sign the lease agreement because it's signed directly with the owner. If you don't check this, it might work out, because we've seen people where it worked out. They just didn't have it checked. And like, for example, our clients, we deal with visas, because for some clients, we do everything. We deal with their visas, we deal with their accommodation, we deal with their health insurance. For some, we do everything. For some of our clients, we only deal with the visa, for example, and they look for accommodation on their own. the first thing we recommend is that if they find a flat they want to sign a lease for, send us the lease and we'll check it. Because again, we need to make sure that it will work for the visa, so we need to make sure that these conditions are met. But sometimes they already found the apartment before they started working with us, or they just like, sometimes it goes really fast. So sometimes we see that they were lucky maybe, and then everything is fine in the lease agreement and we can really use it for the visa process. But we've seen in the past that there were problems with the lease agreements, and then we cannot use it for the visa process. The people cannot use it for the visa process, and then they're in a big trouble because they have to apply. For example, they have the 90 days running out, the visa-free stay. They have to apply for their visa in like 2 weeks, but they have no lease agreement, or they have it but they cannot use it. So what do they do now? Like, do they move? Do they get the virtual proof and risk that they will be denied because of it's like a fake kind of document? Or what they will do? Does the landlord have maybe some other property where they could register them instead of this one? It's always a hassle. So this, like, again, as I mentioned, it takes us 5 minutes, 10 minutes to check it. And it's better, even if you have to pay someone for that, or if we will be happy to do it for free if you get in touch, and if it's not like million of you, so we would spend like 70 hours a week doing that. But if it's like a couple of you, like in some complicated situation, you want us to check it, we'll be happy to do that. And it's definitely better to have someone check it before you sign it than end up in some complicated situation where you cannot use the official lease you signed. Okay, guys, that was the official part. I wanted to make it like short, 10 minutes or something, but I can never do that. I always talk a lot.